Shaq walked into a coffee shop looking like a homeless man. Dirty clothes, messy hair, and a shopping cart full of junk. People stared. Some laughed. Then a cop sneered, "Get out, bum!" The cashier smirked. The customers whispered. But Shaq? He just smiled, because they had no idea who he really was. What he did next shocked the entire city, ended a cop's career, and changed one man's life forever. Stay till the end, because this story will leave you speechless. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of freshly brewed coffee from nearby cafes and the occasional honk of impatient drivers navigating the city streets. Shaquille O'Neal walked among the crowd, but today he wasn't the towering NBA legend or the successful businessman. Today he was invisible. His once pristine clothes had been replaced with tattered layers, his normally clean-shaven head now covered in a worn-out hoodie, and his face smudged with dirt. He pushed a rickety shopping cart filled with old clothes, empty bottles, and a few random objects, things that made it look like this life was all he had. People passed by, their eyes flicking to him for a fraction of a second before turning away, pretending he didn't exist. That was exactly the point. Shaq had seen how the world treated the homeless, how society dehumanized them, treated them like a problem instead of people. He wanted to experience it firsthand, but even he wasn't prepared for how quickly the world turned cold when it thought you had nothing. A businessman in a tailored suit rushed past him, shoving into Shaq's side without so much as an apology. "Watch where you're going, bum," the man muttered under his breath before disappearing into a cafe. Shaq exhaled slowly, keeping his composure. He continued pushing his cart, the wheels wobbling and screeching with every step, until he reached the entrance of a popular coffee shop. The smell of roasted beans and freshly baked pastries called to him, but as he stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted. Customers cast wary glances. A woman clutched her purse tighter. A barista behind the counter sighed loudly, as if his presence alone was an inconvenience. Shaq shuffled toward the register, digging into his pocket and pulling out a handful of coins, barely enough for a small coffee. He placed them on the counter. "Just a black coffee, please." The cashier, a young man with slicked back hair and an unimpressed expression, didn't even look at him. Instead, he scoffed, shaking his head. "We don't serve people like you here." For a second, silence hung in the air. A couple sitting nearby whispered to each other, one of them laughing under their breath. Shaq studied the cashier's face, searching for any trace of remorse, any flicker of humanity. He found none. "It's just coffee, man," Shaq said, his voice calm but firm. The cashier finally looked at him, his lip curling in disgust. "I said we don't serve your kind. Now get out." Shaq felt his hands clench, but before he could say another word, a voice cut through the tension. "Is there a problem here?" Shaq turned. A uniformed officer stood up from a nearby table, resting one hand on his belt. His badge gleamed under the cafe's lights, but there was no warmth in his expression, only authority and irritation. "I think it's time you move along," the officer said coldly, stepping closer. His eyes flicked down to Shaq's cart, filled with junk, and his lip curled in disgust. A hush fell over the cafe. A few people watched, some with curiosity, others with indifference. No one spoke up. No one challenged what was happening. Shaq had come here to witness how the world treated the homeless. Now he was living it. The officer's fingers tapped against his belt, inching closer to his radio. "I said, move along, or I'll make you." The moment Shaq opened his mouth to respond, the officer took another step closer, his hand still resting on his belt. The look on his face wasn't just authority, it was disgust. "Didn't you hear what the man said?" Officer Daniels sneered, his voice laced with irritation. "You're not welcome here." Shaq held his ground, keeping his voice calm. "I'm just trying to get a cup of coffee, man. That's all." The cashier let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head as he wiped down the counter. A couple of customers at a nearby table smirked, entertained by the unfolding scene. Officer Daniels scoffed, looking Shaq up and down like he was a piece of trash that had wandered in from the gutter. "You people always say the same thing. First it's just a coffee, then you're hanging around, making the place look bad." He waved a dismissive hand. "Now get out before I make you." Shaq could feel the eyes of the cafe on him. Some people were watching with mild curiosity, others deliberately looking away. No one said a word. No one stood up. The officer's fingers twitched near his, The belt. But instead of his gun, he reached for something else, Shaq's shopping cart. Without warning, Daniels yanked it forward, dragging it away from Shaq's grasp. The rickety wheels squeaked in protest as the contents inside shifted and tumbled. "What the hell are you doing?" Shaq asked, his voice still steady but sharper now. Daniel smirked. "Cleaning up the street." He shoved the cart toward the door, sending one of Shaq's few belongings, a faded, rolled-up blanket, spilling onto the floor. A couple sitting by the window exchanged nervous glances but didn't intervene. The cashier snickered under his breath. A teenage girl sitting near the corner hesitated before raising her phone, quietly hitting record. Shaq exhaled, his massive frame still relaxed. He wasn't going to break character just yet. Instead, he took a slow step forward. "Look, officer," Shaq said, his voice smooth. "There's no need for all this. I'm not bothering anybody. Just let me buy my coffee and I'll be on my way." Daniels barked out a laugh. "You think you got rights in here? This ain't your living room. And you're loitering." He jabbed a finger toward the door. "Last warning." Shaq said nothing. He was waiting, watching. Daniels tilted his head as if considering something. Then his smirk deepened. He reached for his radio, his fingers pressing down on the button. "We got a loiterer here," he said, his voice dripping with authority. "Might need backup." The radio crackled in response. Another officer's voice came through. "Copy that. On my way." Shaq stayed silent, his expression unreadable. But inside he knew this was about to get real. Daniel's grip on Shaq's arm tightened as he forcefully yanked him toward the curb. The move was rougher than necessary, aggressive, humiliating. But Shaq kept his disguise intact, stumbling slightly, making himself appear weaker than he actually was. "I ain't done nothing," Shaq rasped, his voice raw and weathered, playing the part of a broken man. The officer sneered. "You people are always causing problems. Just move along before I make you." At a nearby table, a well-dressed couple sipped their lattes, watching the scene unfold like it was entertainment. The man leaned back in his chair, smirking. "See? This is why the city's going downhill," he muttered. His wife chuckled, shaking her head in agreement. Shaq gritted his teeth, but he didn't react. He wasn't here for them. But then, from the corner of his eye, he saw something that made his chest tighten. A little girl, no older than 7, sat near the window with her mother. Her wide, innocent eyes flicked between Shaq and Officer Daniels, her tiny hands gripping the edge of the table. She wasn't laughing. She wasn't smirking. She looked confused. "Mommy," she whispered, tugging on her mother's sleeve. "Why is the policeman being mean?" The mother shushed her quickly, casting an awkward glance at the scene before turning her focus back to her phone. Shaq barely had time to process the heartbreak on the little girl's face before Daniels took things a step further. Without warning, the officer smacked Shaq's shopping cart hard, tipping it over. Metal clattered against the pavement as the few items Shaq had, the worn-out blanket, an old thermos, a tattered book, spilled onto the cold concrete. Gasps rippled through the cafe. Even the businessman and his wife stopped smirking. Daniels folded his arms, his expression smug. "This is where you belong," he spat. Shaq stood frozen for a moment. His disguise wasn't just a social experiment anymore. This was real. The officer didn't just see him as a nuisance. He saw him as less than human. A deep heat simmered in Shaq's chest. His fists clenched at his sides. Every instinct screamed at him to stand up and put Daniels in his place. But then, a figure moved beside him. An older man, grizzled and worn by years of struggle, shuffled forward. His clothes were just as tattered as Shaq's disguise, but his hands, rough and scarred, worked quickly to gather Shaq's scattered belongings. "Don't let him break you, man," the old man whispered. Shaq's eyes locked onto the man's, and in them, he saw something unexpected. Not just exhaustion, not just pain, but familiarity. Shaq's breath hitched. He knew this man. But from where? James knelt down, his movements slow and deliberate, gathering Shaq's scattered belongings with careful hands. His fingers trembled slightly, whether from age or exhaustion, Shaq couldn't tell. But what struck him wasn't just the kindness. It was the look in James's eyes. It wasn't pity. It wasn't just sympathy. It was recognition. James had been here before. "Don't let them see you break," James whispered under his breath, his voice hoarse yet steady. Shaq, still maintaining his disguise, crouched down beside him, helping pick up the fallen items. He kept his voice low. "How long you been out here?" James let out a bitter chuckle, stuffing Shaq's tattered book back into the shopping cart. Too long, he sighed. Had a life once, a family, a house. He shook his head. Then I lost it all. One thing leads to another. And here I am. Shaq swallowed, watching James with new eyes. There was a weight to his words, the kind of pain that only came from years of being invisible. Officer Daniels, still towering over them, scoffed. Oh, how touching. A couple of bums bonding. His hand reached out, grabbing James by the coat, yanking him to his feet. Shaq tensed. You want to go with him? Daniels sneered. Keep it up. James winced, gripping his side. He was frail, too frail to be shoved around like this. Shaq's hands curled into fists. His patience was running thin. James quickly raised a hand, signaling Shaq to stay put. He wasn't fighting back. He was used to this. That realization made Shaq's stomach turn. Daniels shoved James aside like he was nothing, sending him stumbling backward. James barely caught himself against a lamppost, wheezing slightly. Something inside Shaq snapped. This wasn't just about his experiment anymore. This wasn't just about proving a point. This was about James, about all the people like him. James straightened up, brushing himself off like it was just another day. Then from the folds of his ragged coat, he pulled out something small, a single crumpled dollar bill. He held it out to Shaq. Here, James said quietly. You need it more than me. Shaq froze. He stared at the worn dollar in James' outstretched hand, his heart pounding in his chest. A man who had nothing was willing to give. Shaq's throat tightened. He wasn't used to this feeling. Helplessness. Daniels let out a cruel laugh. Would you look at that? One broke fool helping another. But Shaq didn't hear him anymore. Because at that moment, he realized something. This wasn't just about Daniels. This wasn't just about the coffee shop. This was about how the world had failed men like James. Shaq slowly reached for the dollar, his fingers brushing against James. And in that instant, he made a decision. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. James's outstretched hand trembled slightly. The crumpled dollar bill still offered between his fingers. Shaq looked at it, then at James, feeling something he hadn't expected. Rage. Not at James, but at the fact that a man who had nothing was still willing to give, while the ones who had everything looked away like he didn't exist. Shaq exhaled sharply and shook his head. Keep it, he muttered, pushing the dollar back toward James. Why you helping me? James gave him a small, tired smile. Because someone should. Before Shaq could respond, Daniel's heavy hand yanked James backward by the collar of his worn-out coat. The old man let out a small grunt, stumbling to stay upright. I told you to get lost, Daniels barked, his voice sharp and unforgiving. Shaq's patience snapped. He straightened to his full height, no longer slouching, no longer playing the part of a helpless man. The moment he rose, the air around them shifted. Daniels barely reached Shaq's shoulders. For the first time, real hesitation flickered across the officer's face. Shaq's voice was no longer raspy, no longer small. It was deep, solid, unshaken. What's your problem, officer? Daniels swallowed, but his arrogance didn't fade. I don't take lip from bums. Shaq didn't blink. I'm not a bum. More people had started to gather. Phones were out, cameras rolling. A few murmurs rippled through the crowd. Wait a second, one man mumbled. Is that? A young woman pushed through the gathering onlookers, her eyes filled with anger. Hey, she shouted at Daniels. Leave them alone. Daniels whipped around so fast his belt rattled. He pointed a finger at her, eyes narrowing. You want to go to jail too? The woman didn't back down. For what? Standing here? Shaq could see it now. Daniels wasn't just a bad cop. He was the kind of man who thrived on fear, on control. But the problem was, he had picked the wrong target this time. More people in the crowd started speaking up. A businessman who had been laughing earlier was now whispering to his friend, looking unsure. The little girl Shaq had noticed before tugged at her mother's sleeve, whispering something. Daniels shifted, realizing too late that the tide was turning. Listen, Daniels growled, trying to assert control. This guy was loitering and... Loitering, the young woman interrupted, voice dripping with sarcasm. So now it's illegal to exist? Daniel's jaw tightened. He reached for his radio again. I'm calling for backup. Shaq took a step closer, his eyes locked onto the officer. Go ahead, he said, voice calm but laced with a warning. Call whoever you want. But I promise you, after today, the whole world is going to know your name. Daniel's fingers twitched near his belt, his radio clutched in his hand. His confidence wavered, but his arrogance remained. The young woman wasn't backing down, and neither was the growing crowd. I saw everything, she repeated, stepping closer. You're harassing them for no reason. Daniel scoffed, shaking his head like she was nothing more than an inconvenience. They're homeless. No one cares, he muttered under his breath, but loud enough for the surrounding people to hear. The energy in the air shifted. A few gasps rippled through the crowd. More people were recording now. Some had even started live streaming. Daniels had no idea how badly he had just messed up. Shaq, still silent, let the moment sink in. His heart pounded, but not with nerves, with certainty. Slowly, deliberately, he reached up and pulled back his hood. The reveal hit like a thunderclap. A collective gasp spread through the crowd, followed by murmurs and whispers. Wait, is that? No way! James, who had been watching the whole thing unfold, blinked in shock. His voice was hoarse. You're not? Daniel's smug expression flickered into something else. Hesitation, uncertainty. He took a small step back, his grip tightening on his radio. Shaq didn't move. He didn't need to. His presence alone shifted the entire balance of power. You're done, he said, his deep voice cutting through the thick tension in the air. I've seen enough, Daniel stammered. I was just... Shaq turned his head toward the crowd, scanning the dozens of phones pointed at them. He lifted his chin slightly. How many of y'all got this on video? He asked, voice calm but commanding. Hands shot up. At least a dozen. Maybe more. Daniels paled. His mouth opened, but no words came out. One of the bystanders smirked and held up his phone. Not just video, man, he said. This is already live. Daniel's jaw tightened as the reality of the situation set in. His confidence, once unshakable, was now cracking like glass under pressure. The murmurs of the crowd grew louder, their faces shifting from curiosity to something more dangerous. Anger. A young man in the front row of onlookers lifted his phone higher. Yo, this is blowing up right now, he muttered. Hundreds of people are watching. Another voice chimed in. Wait a minute. You're Shaq? The crowd erupted. What the hell? No way, that's actually Shaq. Daniel's face drained of color. I didn't know, he stammered, his bravado slipping. He turned his head sharply, looking for an escape, but there was none. Shaq took a step forward, towering over the officer. His massive frame cast a shadow over Daniels, making him seem even smaller than before. That's the problem, Shaq said, his deep voice even and steady. You didn't care. Daniels opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The people recording, the shifting energy in the air, the realization that his career was hanging by a thread, it all hit him at once. Then a crackling voice came through his radio. Officer Daniels, report back. The radio fell silent for a moment, then another voice, sharper, more authoritative. Daniels, where are you? You've got a situation? The crowd parted slightly as a police car pulled up to the curb, lights flashing but sirens silent. A tall man in uniform stepped out, his expression grim as he surveyed the scene. His badge read, Lieutenant Carson. The second Carson's eyes landed on Shaq. He froze. His gaze shifted to Daniels, then to the people holding their phones high, recording every second of this unfolding disaster. Daniels swallowed hard. Carson's radio buzzed again, but he didn't respond. He was assessing the damage, his mind already racing through the possible outcomes. Shaq crossed his arms over his chest, tilting his head slightly. So, Shaq said, his voice laced with challenge, what's going to be done about this? The tension in the air was thick enough to cut. Carson exhaled sharply, eyes narrowing on Daniels. That depends, he said. How much of this is on camera? A dozen phones shot up higher. The crowd answered for him. All of it. Daniels' lips parted, his mind scrambling for an excuse, an explanation, anything to justify what had just happened. But nothing came out. The weight of the crowd's stares, the dozens of recording phones, the imposing presence of Shaq standing over him, it all formed a wall closing in fast. Lieutenant Carson exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Not again, Daniels. Shaq's eyes narrowed. Again? Carson hesitated, shifting his weight uncomfortably. Daniels stiffened beside him. The crowd didn't miss a beat. Murmurs rose. Wait, this ain't the first time? What else has he done? Shaq crossed his arms, waiting for an answer. Carson sighed, rubbing his temple as if a headache had just settled in. Daniels has had complaints before, he admitted. The tension in the air thickened. The crowd had been angry before. But now they were livid. A woman in the front, still holding up her phone, let out a bitter laugh. "Let me guess," she said. "They got dismissed." Carson's silence spoke volumes. The fire in the crowd caught. "Fire him!" someone yelled. More voices joined in. "Fire him! Fire him! Fire him!" Daniel's face twisted in fury. His hands clenched into fists, his shoulders rising with every angry breath. "This is insane," he finally barked. "I was doing my job." Shaq scoffed, tilting his head. "Your job? Bullying homeless people? Harassing innocent folks? That's the job?" Daniels turned to Carson. "You're seriously gonna let this mob decide my future?" Carson shook his head. "Number, you did that yourself." Daniels' jaw clenched. The veins in his neck strained. The crowd erupted into cheers. But in the middle of all of it, James stood quiet, his hands tucked into the pockets of his old tattered coat, his expression unreadable. Shaq noticed. "You good, James?" James shook his head. "Firing him don't change nothing," he muttered. Shaq studied him. "What do you mean?" James looked around at the angry faces, the energy in the air. "Another one'll just take his place," he said. "Another cop who don't care. Another officer who thinks we're garbage." He exhaled slowly. "They take off his badge, throw him out. Then what?" The fire in Shaq's chest burned even hotter. James wasn't wrong. The problem wasn't just Daniels. It was bigger. Shaq rubbed his jaw, then turned back to James, a thought forming in his mind. "Ever thought about working security?" James blinked. "Me?" Shaq smirked. "Yeah, you." The crowd fell silent, their anger replaced with curiosity. Daniel's mouth opened slightly, realization creeping in. Shaq wasn't just exposing the bad, he was about to elevate the good. James blinked, his breath hitching, his hands, worn, calloused from years on the streets, curled into hesitant fists. He'd misheard. He had to have misheard. "Me?" His voice was barely above a whisper. "Security?" Shaq nodded, a small grin tugging at the corner of his lips. "I own businesses," he said. "I could use a good man like you." The crowd murmured in surprise. Some people still recorded, others whispering among themselves. A few smiled. They could see what Shaq saw, a man who just needed a break. James, however, wasn't convinced. He let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "Man, you don't know me," he muttered. "You don't know what I've been through." Shaq's gaze didn't waver. "I know what I saw." Daniels, still seething, scoffed loudly. "You'd trust this bum?" he sneered. "Give him a job? Yeah, let's see how long before he robs you blind." The energy in the air shifted. Shaq turned his full attention to Daniels, his expression unreadable. Then he smirked. "More than I'd trust you." The crowd roared, cheering, clapping, shaking their heads in disbelief at how Daniels had played himself. Daniels' face twisted, his arrogance finally cracking. He turned to his supervisor, his last hope. "You can't be serious about this," he hissed. "You're really gonna let some washed-up celebrity run your department?" Lieutenant Carson exhaled, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Daniels," he said, his voice tired, "turn in your badge." The words hit Daniels like a freight train. His chest rose and fell rapidly. His fingers twitched at his sides. He looked around desperately, as if someone, anyone, might step in and save him. No one did. The crowd's cheers grew louder as realization dawned on him. He wasn't just losing his job. He was losing everything. Slowly, reluctantly, Daniels unhooked his badge from his chest and slapped it into Carson's waiting hand. His gun followed. Carson sighed, shaking his head. "You just couldn't help yourself, could you?" Daniels didn't answer. His fists clenched, his face burning with humiliation. Meanwhile, James still stood frozen, staring at Shaq as if this were all some elaborate joke. He exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face. "Man, I don't even own a shirt that don't got holes in it." Shaq chuckled and patted James's shoulder. "Guess we better fix that." Shaq stepped back, nodding toward the street. "Let's get you cleaned up, boss." James swallowed hard, his chest tightening, not with fear, but something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Daniel's breathing was uneven, his face a deep shade of red as the reality of the situation sank in. Just minutes ago, he was the one in control, yanking Shaq's cart, shoving James, barking orders like he owned the streets. But now he was nothing. His supervisor's voice was firm, unwavering. Daniels, hand over your badge and weapon. Daniels gritted his teeth. You can't do this, he snapped, his hands curling into fists. I was doing my job. The crowd didn't buy it. They jeered, their voices echoing through the street. Shaq exhaled slowly, shaking his head. Your job, he repeated, looked more like bullying to me. More people raised their phones, capturing every second of Daniel's downfall. The entire world would see him for who he really was, not a protector, but a power-hungry officer who thought he was above consequences. Daniels turned his glare toward Shaq, his jaw tight. You set me up, he hissed. You planned this from the start. Shaq chuckled, folding his arms. Nah, man, you did this to yourself. The tension in the air thickened. The moment stretched, hanging between them like a frayed rope ready to snap. Finally, Daniel's supervisor let out a heavy sigh and turned to Shaq. Mr. O'Neill, he said, carefully choosing his words, do you want to press charges? A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some people nodded eagerly, whispering about how Daniels deserved it. Others simply waited, holding their breath. Shaq tilted his head, considering it. His gaze flickered to James, who still looked unsure if this was even real. Then back to Daniels, who stood trembling, his entire career crumbling in front of him. After a long pause, Shaq finally spoke. Nah, he said coolly. Losing his job is enough. Daniel's nostrils flared, his fingers twitching at his sides. His pride wouldn't let him accept this defeat. His voice dropped to a bitter growl. This isn't over. The other officers stepped in, gripping Daniels by the arms as they guided him toward the squad car. He resisted at first, his body stiff with anger, but there was nothing left for him to do. The crowd erupted into cheers as the doors slammed shut behind him. You'll regret this, Daniels shouted through the window, his voice laced with desperation. His eyes darted wildly across the crowd, searching for someone, anyone who might take his side. But nobody did. Nobody cared. The world had already judged him. The squad car pulled away, its tires crunching against the pavement. The once mighty officer, the man who thought he could do whatever he wanted without consequence, was now just another disgraced cop in the rearview mirror. The crowd slowly began to disperse, but Shaq wasn't done yet. He turned to James, his expression thoughtful. We got one problem left to solve, he said, and I know just how to fix it. James stood frozen on the sidewalk, his mind struggling to catch up with everything that had just happened. Just minutes ago, he was being shoved around by Officer Daniels, humiliated in front of a crowd. Now that same officer was gone, hauled away in a squad car, his career in shambles. He turned to Shaq, his voice barely above a whisper. Did that really just happen? Shaq crossed his arms, a small grin forming. Yeah, man, it did. He placed a firm hand on James's shoulder. But we're not done yet. James blinked. What do you mean? I wasn't joking back there, Shaq said. You're coming with me. James frowned, confused. Coming with you where? Shaq didn't answer right away. Instead, he gestured for James to follow him. With hesitation, James shuffled behind him, still wearing his tattered coat, still gripping that $1 bill he'd tried to give away. Minutes later, they arrived at a modest but clean hotel. The automatic doors slid open, revealing a warmly lit lobby with plush seating and a polished counter. The contrast between this place and the streets James had been living on was almost too much. Shaq walked up to the front desk, pulling out his wallet. I need a room, he said. For my guy here. The receptionist, a young woman with glasses, glanced at James, her expression shifting between surprise and skepticism. For how long? She asked. Shaq slid his credit card across the counter. Let's start with a week. James's head snapped up. A week? Shaq turned to him. First thing tomorrow, we're getting you cleaned up. James stared at the hotel key card when the receptionist handed it to him. It felt so small, so light, yet heavier than anything he'd carried in years. Why are you doing this for me? He asked quietly. Shaq shrugged. Because someone should. James clenched his jaw, his throat tight. He had spent years being invisible, being nothing more than another forgotten soul on the streets. Now this someone, was looking at him like he was worth something again. That night, James slept in a bed for the first time in years. No cold pavement, no fear of someone stealing his few belongings. Just warmth, safety, and a chance at something better. The next morning, Shaq was waiting for him outside. Their first stop was a barber shop. The barber, an older man with salt and pepper hair, nodded at Shaq before turning to James. "You're in good hands, brother," he said. James sat down, watching in the mirror as the barber worked. His scruffy beard was trimmed, his matted hair shaped into something presentable. When it was done, he hardly recognized himself. Shaq grinned. "Looking sharp." James swallowed hard, his eyes welling up. "Haven't looked like this in years," he whispered. Shaq patted his shoulder. "Better get used to it, boss." Shaq isn't just giving James a job, he's giving him his dignity back. The internet exploded overnight. Video after video flooded social media. Clips of Officer Daniel shoving Shaq, knocking over his cart, and humiliating James played on every major news channel. The hashtag number sign Shaq exposes corrupt cop trended worldwide. Headlines screamed, "Shaq goes undercover, unveils the ugly truth, and NBA legend humiliates dirty cop in viral sting." The police department issued a public statement within hours. "We do not condone the actions of Officer Daniels. Effective immediately, he has been placed under investigation and relieved of duty." But it was too late. The world had already made up its mind. Daniels tried to defend himself. He appeared on a local news station, sweat glistening on his forehead, claiming it was all a misunderstanding. He blamed stress, protocol, even Shaq himself. "Man set me up," Daniels huffed. "I didn't know it was him." That was the problem. Nobody cared. The people had seen the truth. His excuses meant nothing. Meanwhile, James was stepping into a world he never thought he'd be part of again. Dressed in a clean uniform, new slacks, a pressed button-up, and a badge that read Head of Security, he stood in front of the doors to one of Shaq's businesses, a luxury car showroom. Shaq walked up beside him, arms crossed, nodding approvingly. "How's it feel, boss?" James chuckled, shaking his head in disbelief. "Never thought I'd have a second chance." "You earned it," Shaq said. "Now make sure nobody comes in here trying to scam people like that dealership crook I took down last month." James laughed. A real, full laugh. Something he hadn't done in years. Word spread fast about his comeback. The media picked up his story, calling it "The Homeless Man Who Became Head of Security." Shaq made sure he had a steady paycheck, a place to live, and most importantly, his dignity. But the best moment came weeks later. Shaq's phone buzzed late one evening. James' voice came through the speaker, filled with something new. Pride. "Guess what?" Shaq leaned back in his chair, smiling. "Hit me. I saved up some money. First time in years." Shaq's chest swelled with pride. He knew what this meant. James wasn't just surviving anymore. He was rebuilding. "That's what I like to hear," Shaq said. James hesitated, then added, "I'm thinking about helping other guys like me. You know, the ones still out there." Shaq grinned. "Then let's do it." What started as an experiment turned into a movement, because sometimes the right person in the right place can change everything.